background purposes. The State of Open Data report was developed in 2018 by the Open Data for Development Network with support from the International Development Research Center, IDRC, and published in 2019. Since then, of course, things have changed quite a bit. And the effort was then to update and refresh the State of Open Data report in order for us to understand and for readers to understand what has changed since the first edition was published 4 years ago. We are, today looking at the specific issue, the specific theme on corporate ownership, and we have a distinguished panel with us and have an opportunity to hear from them. What has changed, what has not, what's new, what's next as we go into the next 4 or 5 years. Our chair for this session is Russell-Prywata. I'm hoping I say that right this time. Excellent. She'll be chairing this session and she'll be introducing her panel. I'm looking forward to this session and I hope you are too. Welcome, Louise.
Thanks very much, Machiri. It's a real pleasure to be here. Hello to those of you joining us on Zoom and also those who are following us live streamed today. So, as Machiri said, this is one of a series of dialogues bringing people together to discuss the evolution across open data since the 2018 report and pull out some current and future trends. So thanks to the Open Data for Development Network for convening these. I think it's a really useful opportunity to dive into different sections of the data. And of course, thanks to the Global Data Barometer team and to its funding partners for furnishing us with a really great, rich new data set to discuss. So in this session, we're focusing on the company ownership information module. And I'll kick us off by spending a few minutes setting the scene to share some of the key findings in that module of the Global Data Barometer. And then I'll introduce our wonderful panelists. We'll have 2 rounds of discussion. And throughout this, there's lots of space for some audience participation. So please do post your questions or comments in the chat and we'll get to as many as we can in the time we have. So since 2018, 4 short years, I can't believe actually it's just been 4 years. A lot has happened, both in the world writ large, of course, and with regard to corporate ownership transparency. So in 2018, the State of Open Data research found that the availability of standardized and openly licensed corporate data at source from within corporate registries was pretty limited, and it highlighted an important role of intermediary organizations like open corporates in making significant amounts of open data accessible for reuse. And this, of course, is still very much the case in terms of the role of organizations like open corporates. In terms of the availability of beneficial ownership information, that is information about the real human beings who ultimately own or control companies. By 2018, significant progress had been made to lay some of the technical and policy foundations, but there was an awful lot of work to do in making that a reality. And spoiler for you all, I'm afraid the latest Global Data Barometer set still shows that there's a lot to do, although significant progress has been made. So the new Global Data Barometer company ownership module looked in much greater detail at the availability and also the use of company ownership information. And that covered both basic company information and also beneficial ownership data. So open ownership was the thematic partner for the company ownership module. And that meant we co-designed the indicators with the Global Data Barometer team, then conducting the research as their team and doing data analysis. So I'll share with you really just a brief overview of the 3 main things that the company ownership module looked at. First, it looked at the legal framework and the extent there is a legal framework in place in countries to make beneficial ownership data available. And we really decided to include this as an indicator because, based on the 2018 research, so many countries are still at such an early stage of making data available that it wasn't feasible really just to measure is data available or not. We needed to look a little bit upstream at are there indicators of progress towards making that the case. So that was the first area. Second thing that was looked at is the extent to which beneficial ownership data is available publicly, and where it's available publicly, is it available as structured open data? And then the third thing is it also looked at how beneficial ownership data is being used by actors throughout the private sector and in civil society. So the module in the barometer and indeed the whole global data barometer is an incredibly rich data source covering over 100 countries. It's all available online with a fantastic search function. My colleague Agustina De Luca and I wrote up some of the key findings from the company ownership module, and I'll just share 3 with you here to frame our discussion for today. So first finding was that beneficial ownership data now is quite often collected by governments, but it's much less often made publicly available. And this is obviously of concern for the open data community, and from open ownership's perspective, we see clearly that not making beneficial ownership data public is limiting how useful it is, for example, to uncover corruption or tax evasion. Second finding that I'll mention is that there is a significant variation across global regions in the progress that's being made to make beneficial ownership data openly available. The barometer picked up lots of progress in EU member states, quite a lot of progress across a significant number of countries in Africa, and then a significant and growing level of interest in Southeast Asia. However, it found much less progress in Latin American countries. And it might be nice if we're able to touch on why these variations might be the case in our discussion later. And the third finding I'll mention is that where data is available publicly, it's often not available in a structured computer readable format. And this is very likely to be limiting use of that data. So that said, it's still a picture of work in progress, but we are significantly further forward compared to a few years ago, thinking back to the 2018 findings. And there's a really quite an exciting range of opportunities ahead. So on this note, I'll introduce our speakers that we're going to hear from today. I'm pleased to be joined by Florencia Lorenzo. She's a researcher at the Tax Justice Network. She's based in Latin America, and she's part of TJN's core research team working on their what I describe as their flagship reports, anyway, the Financial Secrecy Index and the Corporate Tax Haven Index. Pleased to be joined by Oluseun Olingbide, who is the co-founder and director of BudgIt. BudgIt's a civic tech organization in Nigeria that's really pioneered data-driven approaches to a whole range of transparency and accountability efforts. And finally, we're joined by my colleague here at Open Ownership, Stephen Abott Pugh. He's our head of technology. Stephen leads the development of the Beneficial Ownership Data Standard and Open Ownership suite of technical tools that are really there to support people to use beneficial ownership data. So I'm going to turn to each of our panelists in turn, but first I want to put out a question, not just to the panelists, but for our audience here in the Zoom room too. Why do you think that globally linkable company ownership information is important, and how would you use it if it was available? And when I can, I will just copy this question into the chat. Please post your answers in the chat so we can start to look at getting some conversation going and perspectives from in the room. So in this first round of discussions, I'd really welcome the panelists' views on the question I just asked our audience too, but perhaps you can tell us a bit about what's being done now with the open data that's already available on company ownership. And then second part of the question, particularly perhaps to Stephen, is the technology for linking ownership data ready to go? And therefore is securing the next stage of progress fundamentally a policy issue? So I'll pass to Stephen first. If you could keep your intervention perhaps this round to 5 minutes or so for each speaker, then that will make sure we get good time for interactions. Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Louise. And yeah, thank you to everyone for joining us today. It's really interesting to discuss this and to look at the updates that have happened since 2018. So I think looking back on the report from 4 years ago, a lot of the work that was being done then has matured and carried on going, as Louisa said. So Open Corporates is now up to having more than 200 million companies, and they are growing their team, and they are increasingly being used by a large number of businesses as a real fundamental source of information. We see projects like GLIFE, or the Global Legal Entity Identifier Foundation, doing really good work to provide the LEIs that increasingly being required for large companies taking part in the global market. So there are all these pieces of the puzzle about how you work out who owns companies. So this is specifically talking about company ownership data. And those things carry on maturing. I'm glad to say that open ownership since 2018 has been working with a whole number of governments. And I think Louise is right. We're basically at the stage where a lot of them are still trying to grapple with laying the groundwork for how they get ready to publish data. And a kind of a worrying thing from where I sit sometimes is that people think that once they get a register launched and there's some data out there, that that's job done. And actually, we all know it's not. And it's really important how people use the data afterwards to try and tackle some of these problems, some of these global issues that have been identified by everyone from the UN to the World Bank to the IMF to Tax Justice Network and Transparency International, other colleagues here. So what I really hope to see in the coming years is the kind of increased acceptance that this global problem needs a global solution, and that connecting up all the data that people have is part of that. We can see that kind of rhetoric and a discussion starting to happen in the EU. Recently, Germany has pointed out that not enough people are using their beneficial ownership data. The Financial Action Task Force have just published a whole load of new guidance, and I don't know if everyone's had a chance to look at it, but it really leans heavily on countries having to use their data, having to check the data, having to verify it, having to make sure they can share it with government colleagues and everything like that. So really that's what countries are going to be judged on by FATF in 3 or 4 years' time. And in order to get to that place, lots of countries really need to get moving quicker. I'm very excited that we at Open Ownership have worked with a number of countries. So Latvia, Armenia, Nigeria, who have started to do things like adopting our data standard. All of them, I think, at different stages realize that what they want to do is collect data that they can connect with other data sources, with other people's information. In Nigeria, people want to connect it with the data from the UK. If you speak to people in the Philippines, they're worried about business going to Singapore. There's a real understanding that almost every country wants to see their data linked with other countries. And if only we can capitalize on that enthusiasm, then I hope we can get more people to kind of embrace this. And I do think as well that in the coming year, we have a large number of big countries. So you've got Canada, you've got New Zealand, you've got all of the overseas territories and crown dependencies that have to have some form of public register by the end of 2023. So I really do hope that there's more momentum around making this information public that happens in the next year or so. So yeah, it's really all of the people who are identified in the previous report are going from strength to strength, but I think especially around beneficial ownership data, there needs to be even more kind of work done on that.
Thanks, Steve, that overview. There's plenty more we could dig into on this, but I really want to pass to Oluseun next, if I may. Thank you for joining us today. Steve talked about lots of pieces of the puzzle, he said, fitting together and maturing to make it easier for people to use company ownership data. Your organization has innovated so much in this space to actually get people to be able to use the data and working with the data yourselves. Can you share your perspective on this? What's happening now with regard to using beneficial ownership data, and how can we make the most of that?
All right, thank you so much. It's a pleasure, and I'm happy with the work that open ownership is doing that is important. I'm also glad to hear from Stephen about the work on beneficial ownership. Yes, I mean, everybody who hears about Nigeria understand how we have been somehow called a notorious corrupt country for corruption. And I know we're trying to shake off that image for a long time. And I think one of the key things after we've had conversations on fiscal transparency, open contracting, is to also look into the idea of who benefits from what. It's a bit challenging in Nigeria because we have rules that bound public office holders to disclose their assets to get into public office. But there's a constitutional measure that restricts the public from seeing such kind of information. So in recent times, the Corporate Affairs Commission, or which we call like the Public Registry for Companies, decided to apply to beneficial ownership approaches. And also the NEITI, which is the Extractive Audit Agency in Nigeria, also developed a platform for the beneficial ownership structure for the extractive companies and also those who own the oil mining leases and the acreages and the contracts. It's been great work, and I have to agree that it's been helpful for the CSOs like us because it now makes us understand clearly that we can dive deeper into investigative stuff around who controls what, who gets what. Well, the first thing I feel that for us to be able to use beneficial ownership effectively, some things we've learned is that it has to join up with other data systems. In a standalone situation, it offers a lot, but we will not fully maximize the opportunity if we not effectively join up beneficial ownership data with other data systems. For example, in Nigeria, you have the spending data of government that is available on a website called opentreasury.gov.ng. And that's where you can find all the Nigerian spending data. There's somehow we have to be able to figure out how do you link the spending data that provides also contract details and the contractors. How do you link that up into the beneficial register? How do you link that up even possibly even to the PEP register, like the political and spokespersons? So that when you triangulate that level of information, you're certain that you can find deeper insight and deeper awareness in things. And I think that's the next phase for us in terms of the conversations we've had with CSCs, that this data as a standalone is important and it's critical, but for us to make much more meaningful of it, we need to join in. The second thing around beneficial ownership heavily from us has to do with how do we even build institutional response mechanisms into it. Because sometimes the data might not be up to date, or we figure out that some of the data systems might not even be fully reflective of the true state of things. So is there a strong institutional response to be able to that? We can flag some certain corporations and companies and say, can you dive a little bit deeper in this? Because somehow the personalities involved with the people who do not just add. I'm in Morocco for the OGP Middle East Africa meeting, and one of the big conversations we have with the head of Nigeria's public registry in here, which is about there has to be some form of handshake between the civil society, media, and public institutions so that we have a close feedback with institutional framework. And I think those are the two major points where we are kicking off things in terms of beneficial ownership. But like I said, it's not perfect, but I think it meets the fundamental threshold. And it's good that we now have to take a step forward that we have to make it much more useful. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And it's a good reminder that this week still the event, the regional meeting of the OGP is happening in Morocco. And there is, for those of you who haven't been following that, then there is a big session, was a big session on beneficial ownership with the Nigerian Corporate Affairs Commission that you just mentioned. And I think that's a great example of really what you're saying is, yeah, it's great, there's progress, but it's not perfect, there's more to do. And of course, you've highlighted a couple of the really key use cases in terms of tackling corruption, but also specifically oversight of understanding who's benefiting from government contracts. So I think, again, there's a lot more we could talk about later on in the discussion on this. But first, Florencia, I now want to turn to you because I suspect you may well be telling us about the tax justice use case for this information. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luis, and thank you all for the invitation to talk about transparency of corporate ownership and how, why is it important and how can we move towards pushing for this agenda, which is so dear for all of us which are here. So basically, I wanted to focus a bit on the question and then try to bring some other points. And then you ask, why is it important to have globally linkable corporate ownership data? And I think that firstly, on a very basic level, it is really important that we have more access to this information, because it's the only way we can have a complete picture of what companies, and especially multinational companies, really look like. As all of us who are here know, a multinational company consists of hundreds of subsidiaries or legal entities, many of which are subject to different laws and jurisdictions. And relevant data on these different firms are often dispersed through several jurisdictions. So having linkable data is key to actually having a true picture of what companies look like, right? And this is important not only for academic and because it's interesting to know purposes, but also for combating all types of ills that come from financial opacity, such as money laundering, tax evasion, and abuse, including here also tax avoidance, and also systemic risks to financial stability. For instance, if we had a complete picture of what multinational companies really look like, this could be particularly useful for authorities in developing countries, which may build upon this information, especially information which is already being collected and made available by developed countries, to understand who really benefits from foreign legal vehicles that conduct economic activities in their countries or even own certain assets. And I think here it really connects with the point Oluseun was making. For instance, if we had this information available, we could also run all types of risk assessments, like looking, for instance, at geographic secrecy risks. So in our research, we rank countries according to the extent to which they provide financial secrecy to other countries. So if we had this information linkable, we can run some types of risk assessments. We can also look at risks that derive from corporate complexity. So most companies actually have a very simple structure of ownership. And if we understand better those companies that have a more complex structure, this could allow us to better allocate investigative efforts. And of course, all of this really depends a lot on the extent to which the legal framework which is in place is effective, if it's covering all legal owners, if the thresholds are not easy to be escaped when we're talking about beneficial ownership information. But there's a lot of space to build upon that. And one last point, which I think is really, it gained a lot of visibility recently, and I think it creates a really important point to push for. It's connecting corporate ownership data with information on ownership of actives. So in the Tax Justice Network, we've been pushing a lot for together with several other organizations, for what we call a global asset register, because when we have information on the whole corporate ownership chain, we can also connect this information to information about ownership of assets, such as houses, yachts, and all arts, all types of assets, which is something that gained a lot of visibility now during the war on Ukraine, with the efforts of sanctioning some Russian oligarchs. So this is another really important development that I think we can advance together with this agenda around globally linkable data on corporate ownership. I think this.
Thanks so much. There's so much ground we've covered. Before we move on, I just want to read out a couple of comments from the Zoom room. Open data can help appropriate taxation, links very much with what some of the speakers have said, and prevent tax evasion. And it's also useful for economic and sociological studies, and that sort of academic use case. Florencia, you touched on as, it's not the only reason, but it's another important reason. And then second comment from the Zoom room is that globally linked data could be a game changer on data quality through consistency checks that then leads to greater confidence in the data and enhanced use cases where regulated and non-regulated sectors can really rely on beneficial ownership data for customer due diligence, know your customer requirements. And that's an important use case. I think that we hadn't quite brought out that idea of open linkable data being easier to verify and therefore being able to be more relied upon by a variety of actors, including companies looking to use it within their due diligence. So I think if I may be so bold as to summarize, like nearly 30 minutes into the discussion, what we're saying overall is that there's some good progress, but we're not all the way there yet, of course. And there's a really clear set of use cases for this information and for this information being publicly accessible. They span anti-corruption, tackling tax evasion, also tax revenue collection, domestic resource mobilization, through to private sector due diligence. And then, as you mentioned, Florencia, things like imposing sanctions. And so there's that really broad set of use cases. And there's more focus now, certainly than there was 4 years ago, on how we can get people to use data, the importance of data actually being used. And then, as Oluseun, you were saying, the practice of actually using data means more often than not connecting it with other data sets, such as procurement information, etc. So I'd like to turn now to where do we go from here, looking ahead to the future. I have another question for those in the Zoom room. And then obviously also would welcome the speakers' thoughts on this too. Question for you all: how can civil society actors, which I think looking around perhaps many of us are, how can civil society actors best support the adoption and use of open data on company ownership? So very much looking at what civil society can do. I'll post that question in the chat in a minute. And then I think we'll go into another round of panel discussions, and I might sort of change things up slightly because the question I had initially planned for this was, what are the main policy changes to achieving this vision of linkable company ownership data? And I think that's still a really valid question, but I might rephrase it slightly more broadly and say, what are the main challenges to achieving internationally linkable company ownership data? Are they just really or primarily policy changes, or are there other challenges? And I think if we have a round sort of surfacing challenges from each of our speakers, followed by perhaps some comments from the speakers and hopefully those in the Zoom room on actually how civil society actors can best support overcoming those challenges so we can make progress. And Florencia, I know that you've actually just spoken, but I'd still like to, if you don't mind, turn to you first, because I'd be really grateful for yours and Tax Justice Network's perspective on what are these main challenges to achieving internationally linkable company ownership data, and what can we do about them?
Thank you for the question. I think that there are several challenges, but maybe one of the key ones, which I think is something which was already mentioned in the previous report, but I think still needs to be a lot advanced in this regard, is the idea that we need to move towards having a unique global identifying number for each company that would allow us to connect information. And a unique and uniform number with established data verification is an important condition for matching data records from different sources, because as we know, companies' names can change, they can be misspelled, and they can even be written in alphabets which vary from country to country. So if each jurisdiction only provides its own identifier number, like a tax identification number or a business register number, it's really difficult to create this link. So moving towards this shared standard, which in the Tech Justice Network, we push for the adoption of the legal entity identifier, which was proposed by the Financial Stability Board. It's a key policy necessity that we need to push for. And I think that anyone that actually tried to manually research ownership chain of a legal entity through several registers can know that this is like a very big issue. Like when connecting data, it's often hard to find. Sometimes the company will have changed the name, sometimes it will be in a different alphabet. So creating a shared standard, it's really important. And as you mentioned, in our flagship project, the Financial Secrecy Index, one of the components is precisely analyzing whether countries are adopting this standard. So, and we find that to this moment, no country requires all companies and relevant legal vehicles to use the standard, but some countries are already implemented it for some sectors of the economy. So I think this may be a major area to push for. And also there are a couple of other issues that I think it's really important to keep in mind as well. The first of them is regarding the requirement to register and publish legal ownership data. There's a lot of momentum and attention around beneficial ownership data, but even in countries that have advanced a lot in beneficial ownership transparency still don't require registration of all the legal owners, or do not make this information publicly available, especially not in an open data format. There are several countries that publish in the public register information on the legal owners, but often as company statutes and not as a structured data. So if we don't have information on the legal owners, it's really, and then we are talking not only of the first layer of ownership, but also all of the layers of ownership. If we can't identify the full ownership chain, it's really difficult to verify this data. And then also in terms of a policy challenge that we face and that we push for a lot is the idea that the thresholds which were disseminated around beneficial ownership transparency are too high, and this means that they are easily to be avoided. We have a lot of companies that have beneficial ownership data registered, but when you look at who is registered, it's only a member from the management team. So if we really want to understand who owns or benefits from the company, we need to push for beneficial ownership frameworks that actually capture all the ways that ownership can be understood and control can be understood. So.
Really good, solid set of challenges. Thanks. The things I've written down. So you've got I'm interested actually to hear whether you and other speakers see these as primarily policy or technical challenges, because to my mind they cross over. There's the one around a globally stable legal identifier for companies that on the face of it would seem a technical challenge, but then as you said, this is about getting policy will to actually implement this in a decent number of jurisdictions so it actually can make a difference. There's the issue of how to verify data that came up in the chat as well, and the role of collecting and making publicly available information on full company ownership chains in order to actually assist with doing that. And then there's a really helpful reminder that actually, whilst we spend, particularly for us at Open Ownership, we spend all day, every day talking and thinking about beneficial ownership, legal ownership data isn't already available. And the thing I wrote down for your challenge on the structured data was do away with the PDFs, because all too often we see researchers finding some statute documents online downloadable as PDFs, and that obviously, that doesn't assist people in working with the data. And then, of course, you also mentioned thresholds, another really important issue. Oluseun, I'd like to turn to you again, if I may, please, and just get your sense of how do those challenges sound? Do they resonate with you? Do you encounter a different set of challenges or some overlap in this in your work with BudgIt and indeed beyond? The floor is yours.
Thanks so much. And thanks so much, Florencia, for that position. And to be honest with you, there's an overlap. Let me even start from that point first. And the overlap is that we start with the thesis that public resources must be properly accounted for. You know, public resource accountability is critical. We're in an environment where public resources are very limited and not even able to fix the scale of challenges we have. And so there is a huge push on our own side for public sector efficiencies and resource accountability. And what we now get to understand that when we have an opportunity to see what's the underlying prerogative in awarding public contracts, are we doing this just for people with political exposures? Are we doing this just for political benefit and things like that? Because we're very, very clear that once those kind of key elements are in there, that public contract is highly susceptible to corruption in some sort of way. If public office projects are used to settle political opportunities or political demand, so it's possible that you're going to get corruption. So for us, the overlap in our work is how this helps us in terms of uncovering people behind companies, and that helps our own drive and push for resource accountability. That's something that is critical for us. The second thing is also strengthening partnerships with the media. So a lot of people in the media want more deeper insights about the state of things. So for example, if you find a case of corruption and you don't know you know the names of the company and you don't know the promoters or the beneficial owners of the company, you want to get into the beneficial ownership register and being able to uncover them. So that's what helps us into building capacity and building partnerships with the media to say, if you're stuck on this piece of information, this is where you find it. And this is how you navigate such platform, and this is how you can build that triangulation. So we have had some few conversations with journalists and training with them, where we're able to look at how this how the tools, either from the CAC or from any ITI, is very useful for them in terms of interpreting situations as much as possible. So I think I will stay on those two things as overall. There are challenges, as you could imagine. And I think the major challenges is how do you elicit civic use of this platform? You know, because it's good to be able to build this kind of disclosures, but it looks like people have a whole lot of things going on in their life, and they want a lot of creative and persuasive messaging to be able to get them able to use the platform. What we have built now is a beneficial ownership platform. It's still limited to civil society and media being able to apply that. And that's even a very, very few set up there. It's something that should be mainstream, that people should see how crucial beneficial ownership issue is critical in fighting corruption. For example, like I mentioned, there's a code of conduct bureau that collects asset register for each Nigerian senior officer or maybe elected officer. But that information is not public. If we're going to be able to force the information to be public and becoming voluntarily public, it means that we would have to get a mass number of citizens talking about it. So that's why being able to mainstream beneficial ownership was general civic use is also a challenge. I think there's something we have to do around the language and the communication of things to be able to push each moves, because we have people more interested in budget, in contracts and things like that. But this is the fundamental plank where you're sensitive. If decision making is stunted because personal, political interests are taken in place, and that at the time is we get to, definitely you can have optimal outcomes and optimal resource skills. So I think those are the kind of things that we have to improve the communication as well. So I would leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And I always like it and appreciate it when people push and challenge me and others in this space to connect with people outside of our usual sort of network of partners, to engage through the media and engage really to, as you said, elicit civic use of this data. How do we make people care about this beyond those of us who spend our professional lives working in and with this data? So yes, lots more that we could go into there. But Steve, I want to pass to you next, not just because you're somebody who lives, works and breathes beneficial ownership on a daily basis, but please, it would be great to hear your sense of, what the main challenges are to realizing this vision of internationally linkable data, and what can we do about them?
So the interesting thing for me about this question is, and about where policy and technology meets, is that we're asking, and international governments are asking, company registrars who've traditionally kind of stored some information, a lot of them done it in paper, to become people who check that information, who make sure everyone has the right IDs, to chase up and almost be kind of law enforcement if people are sending them information that's incorrect. And yet, I don't think we're having the conversation that they're getting a lot more money. At least in a lot of the countries where we're working, there's a real crunch where registrars were likely going through the process of kind of digitizing. In some countries, there's really great examples of where countries have a single kind of national ID for a person. And there's some countries like Latvia springs to mind where they're trying to use that ID across multiple systems. And that has helped them to bring these kind of benefits and cost savings. But in a lot of other countries, it's a huge leap. Out there are dozens of companies that are working on entity resolution. They're taking data and saying, we can't work out who these people are, let's sell a service to make sure you can say that this is one person. There are other people who are selling company data because they have a big technology team to pull that all together. And we're kind of asking company registrars to do all of that, to bring all of that in-house, to make the data better, to make sure they know who the people are. And I completely agree with that approach. I just think it's a huge challenge for them if they don't get a lot more money. In a lot of places where we're working, we're trying to develop tools that open ownership so that if people do release data or release data that's at least open, we can show them how we could turn it into data that can be linked up with other countries. So we already do that for data from the UK, Denmark, Slovakia, and Ukraine, to show that you don't have to necessarily publish in line with our data standard, but if you publish good quality data, it can be transformed in ways that help you to connect it with other sources. And we're increasingly, building tools, and we're trying to work with partners to make software available so people can create that kind of data themselves. But it's a big leap in a lot of countries to go from paper-based systems to a fully digital system where they can check everything. And if they're going to be reliant on there being some kind of national ID that they can call upon, that calls for a whole of government approach that is often been quite slow to come in some of the jurisdictions. So, the tools that we offer allow you to use a passport number, a tax ID, or any kind of other identifier to try to make sure you can get that unique ID for companies and for people. But I guess from my side, that's where I see the two things colliding. I do think some of these issues will get a lot easier in years to come. There are definitely solutions out there for converting data that exists, or for publishing tools to allow you to publish the information if you wanted to go public with data that's held privately. But yeah, I guess those are some of the key challenges. But I would echo what Florencia said about the importance of doing that hard work of getting those IDs. There are a bunch of countries that we've worked with where they don't have public company registers, so they aren't keen on publishing the IDs for companies, and that really undermines the value of any beneficial ownership data that's put out there, because it makes it a lot more difficult to use. So yeah, I think all of these issues are kind of there. I'm sure there's going to be a bunch of people offering kind of commercial solutions to them, but it's a big question of whether governments are going to invest to have that kind of in-house government experience and really bolster their registrars, as this conversation is happening in the UK at the moment with new legislation for Companies House, or whether they're going to do more partnerships with the private sector who might have some kind of technical solutions and work that they can offer to people. Yeah, the balance of that in the coming years is going to be very interesting to see where that works out, and how governments kind of prioritize or not the ability for people who work in the government to use the data. Just a couple of examples. So we've had conversations in the recent days about South Africa have 5 different beneficial ownership registers from 5 different departments. Are they going to have, could the government invest in having one team that helps all of those 5 different departments to use the data and to combine it? Perhaps will one of those departments get more money than the others to kind of step up and be the lead on it? It's a real kind of, that side of things is a really big policy challenge that increasingly more and more countries are going to have to work out their response to, whether it's investing in their own resources or partnering with people outside government, I think.
Thanks, Stu. It's always good to have that sort of little dose of reality, really, with more responsibilities being placed on government agencies in times of often strained and or reducing budgets, rather than the investment that would be needed to realise what are in many cases quite ambitious digital transformation efforts that extend well beyond company ownership information. That said, I don't want to dwell too much further on the challenges. I think we probably have another sort of 15 minutes or so. I really would like to invite anyone in the Zoom room who has a question for our speakers. Please do post your question in chat and I'll get that asked. Whilst you're thinking of questions, I'll just read out a comment from the chat that I think sums up things pretty well. The challenge is moving from political and public advocacy into quite challenging technical design and implementation. And there's a link there as well. Thank you very much. And I would agree with this. I think when we look back at the 2018 research, some of the foundations were there, and a lot of the advocacy and political will had been sort of mobilized. We're now at this stage knee deep in the technical design and implementation. So all of the challenges that you spoke about, Florencia, that are causing these like barriers and challenges to people properly being able to use the data, they're all coming up. So I might sort of add a third element to that, which is I feel like we're looking at moving from political and public advocacy. We're in the challenging technical design implementation, and where we need to look to get to is this space where we've got really more extensive and scaled data use that's delivering impact across the whole range of use cases that we talked about. So because I'm an optimist, I'd really like to go and ask our speakers, each of you, to please sum up with a takeaway of like, where should we go next? So what do you think? If you don't have to pick one thing and it'd be like the only thing, but what do you think is the most important, or should be one of, say, the top 3 things that we as a community of people and organizations who care about beneficial ownership, what should we focus on for the next couple of years? Is it looking beyond companies? Is it focusing on linkable data? Out of all of the things that we've covered, what springs to mind? And Florencia, I know that you focus so eloquently on the challenges that I also perhaps wonder if you want to comment on the question I asked earlier to the speakers about how civil society and other actors can best support adoption and use of company ownership data. So do you mind if I turn to you first? Then I might turn to Stephen afterwards, and then to Oluseun to wrap us up. So Florencia, over to you.
Thank you for the question. I think that there's a lot there to unpack. I think I really value the point Stephen made on the different challenges of turning like this political abstract projects in implementation into specific countries. I think there's also like a very big discussion on how does it play out in countries which have federal structures. For instance, I think that this is a big issue in Latin America because company registers are often subnational and not centralized. And then different authorities come into play to deal with these different federal structures. And also, I think it also brings a bit about the point that Luis made at the beginning, which I think is also a very important point about like how different regions are accepting or not the idea of information being public, and what can we do to improve the discussion, not only at a global level, but on a regional or national level. I think it's a key point for the discussion. But I wanted to focus a bit more on the idea of what organizations can do among us. So what type of shared expertise we can build to have a robust set of people that are able to push and engage with this topic and advance these shared objectives. Because I think a lot of the challenges of moving from the political, the point that Tim made in the chat of moving from the political to the technical, is that often people have different skills, and it's not very easy to navigate both sides of the coin, which is like the political and the technical side. So I guess I would say that there is a lot to do in terms of collaboration from different actors from the civil society ecosystem, since we are all specializing in different levels of analysis. So bringing inputs and sharing what we have, and like the different, because we have now several different projects which are assessing countries often on the same dynamic, not exactly the same things, but so building a shared understanding between different people is, for me, an important point to grow. And I think an example from our research in the Financial Secrecy Index might come as relevant here, because as some of you may know, in the Financial Secrecy Index, a large component of our indices focuses around legal and beneficial ownership registration and whether this information is made public. And previously, we used to evaluate whether this information was made public in an open data format as well. But in the last cycle, we realized we did not have sufficient in-house expertise to actually assess if information comply with open data standards, because, as you know, for something to be available in open data, it's not enough that it's structured in a certain way, but it has to have a certain license requirement. It has to be on a certain format. So building this shared expertise on what it is to be open data and how we can push for it, I think it's one key point. And I think another example of collaboration, which also comes to mind, is related to the case of Denmark. As many of you know, Denmark's corporate register is a very good register in terms of search capabilities. You can search by the company, by the owner, and it has information, you can download it. But when we were researching, we found out by collaborating with some partners that some local partners pointed to us that the register was allowing beneficial owners not to disclose certain information for issues of on a data privacy level, but the information that was now being made available was not enough to sufficiently identify the owner. So I think it's a good example of how the interplay between the legal frameworks and the technical frameworks are also something really we need to keep in mind, because even if you have a great technical solution, some legal advancements that may be happening in another level may make the system which is in place not good enough for use, because information available is not sufficient. So I would point to I think both examples shows to the idea that since we have people working at different levels of, we need more collaboration among us to build shared understanding and push forward this agenda.
Always support a call for more collaboration, and I think you put it really well when in that framing of when moving from the technical and public advocacy through to political and public advocacy through to technical implementation. It's a totally different skill set. There's no need for the same people to be sort of having all of the same skills, because as a community, then in general, we have different pieces of the puzzle between us all and all the people we work with in our network. So having spaces to collaborate in a way that actually sort of shares those skills, and organizations being able to bring in one another when different skills than the ones they have are called for, I think is really important. And that applies across this sort of policy technology divide as well. I'm just going to quickly read out a question that's come in chat. What more can be done to build support for beneficial ownership in the private sector as users of the data, not just companies providing and disclosing data? And how can we then use that to support and drive the agenda forwards? And I think that perhaps, if I can be so bold as to join that up to the collaboration point, that's an often, I think, probably overlooked area where, say, civil society, government and international institutions and companies themselves can also collaborate. And I do see pockets of this happening, both nationally and at international level, but it is sort of, yeah, pockets of it happening rather than the normal sort of run of business. So Steve, perhaps I can turn to you next if you wish to speak to that particular question, or just give us your sense of where we go next and what the most important focus should be for the next couple of years.
So I'll try and connect what I was going to say with that question. I mean, private sector users would want more global coverage. I've had a few conversations with people where they say, oh, you know, it's all right to have all of the data from the UK and Denmark and Slovakia and everyone connected. But what we really want is 10 countries, 20 countries, 30 countries, 40 countries, because that's really valuable to people. You know, people are paying good money to go to a Bureau van Dijk kind of Orbis database that has 40 million companies, really detailed information on them, whereas our database that has 9 million companies is not quite as detailed, not quite as good. But the way that I would link your original question with that is there are registers that exist that are good, that have good data or that have some data, and we need to pressure the countries to make those public. I'm thinking of Luxembourg, I'm thinking of Cyprus, I'm thinking of Germany. Like, it is ridiculous that countries in the EU are not publishing this information. Everything from the last 3 anti-money laundering directives should point them towards making more and more of it public, and we don't really see that happening. But in the next year, if all the countries stick to their promises, you will have Canada having a public register, you'll have New Zealand having a public register, you'll have all the crown dependencies and overseas territories. So how do we build on, even if all those don't do it, even if only half of them do it, that's a large number of public registers going live in 2023 throughout the year. How do we build that momentum to start pointing at some of the countries that the Tax Justice Network often points out are in the EU and other places that we really need more transparency about what's going on in those countries? It's not just the small kind of islands, it's not just the small tax havens. And I don't think that AMLD6 in the EU is really strengthening the language enough. The EU has been at the forefront of kind of trying to push for this, and they kind of say that registers should be public, but as the Tax Justice Network has shown and Transparency International have shown, you know, Germany's register is, you have to register and you have to pay, but it's still public. Cyprus's register, you have to pay €3.50 per record, and that only gets you the information for one company. It doesn't even get you the full kind of ownership chain for them. So it feels kind of wrong to me that there are these registers there that very few people are using. All of the evidence points to kind of increasing value for opening those up, making them more available. And I would be perfectly happy if those countries just did it by publishing the data and then let people come along and try to make sense of it. I mean, obviously, I would love them to use our data standard and to do it properly. But, you know, if they don't, the OCCRPs of this world, the ICIJs are just, they're getting this information. They're creating it themselves. They're creating databases. They're using leaked information. And it seems to me like the evidence base is pointing towards there being more value for the countries for making it public. So why don't they have a database? They've collected the information. It might not all be correct. A lot of it might be old. You won't know that until they open it up. So maybe being optimistic, I would call on all those countries that have registers to open it up, and for us to somehow use the pressure of more and more countries going public in 2023 to point at the ones that are still holding out and not making their information public.
Thanks, Steve. Nicely put. Oluseun, I'm interested to hear your sense of what we should all be focusing on in the coming years, and I'm sure you'd support perhaps some of the what Steve said in terms of reducing basically the kind of barriers and friction to actually using this data and working with it. But what's your perspective? What do you think the priority should be?
Yeah, I like the point about private sector, getting momentum from the private sector to be able to do more voluntary work in doing for beneficial ownership. We might be talking about thousands of companies in here, and so we don't even sure that we have the regulatory structure and the capacity for them to be able to do that. I think even on this issue of beneficial ownership, there should be more work around engaging the private sector. I think one place we can be is to use trade associations, multilateral agencies, for example, the UN Global Compact that deals with much more work around private sector engagement at the multilateral level. Those are things that could be useful to be able to explain to non-profits and to for-profit organizations that these are the importance of beneficial ownership in environmental work. And I think that's something that I think it's critical, because I figure out that most of the time the regulatory organizations are overwhelmed in terms of being able to update this register consistently. But there has to be a framework where the private sector is almost able to willingly provide continuous updates of these things. And I think automating it, as you've seen maybe in other countries, will also be very useful. People are able to do much more online filing. So in Nigeria, for me to automate updates, my register means that I still have to go through a document and get a lawyer and go through a bureaucratic structure. Whereas it will be much more useful that I'm able to provide updates. TSC is able to validate all of that online and able to update the register automatically. So the process of even getting the register updated so that we know that we're dealing with factual and accurate information is also very, very, very important. So I think in my way that the private sector engagement is important, and because we need to get a lot of buy-in into it. In a time of where you have tax havens and you have a lot of people using corporate shells and different ownership structures to mask beneficiation, you need to also technically bring them on board about how this is important in terms of tax management, in terms of even protecting the integrity of the country. And also there also should be a lot of work that's been done at the regulatory capacity too. At the registry, there has to be more work on getting public registers to be able to easily for people to also meet. And those key into things around ease of doing business. So for me, I think those are two things. There's still a big question around the sanction system, but I figure out that that's something that we also have to put in. But sometimes in countries like mine, I mean, we say like this is a very early stage. Let's get enough disclosure out there. Let's make sure that we have mechanisms that make sure that these disclosures are accurate and are up to date. Let's ensure that there's more uptake on those disclosures, and people are synthesizing that with more data, and there's a more usage of such information. Then we can come to the position of where we now talk about sanctions and accountability and other things. But I figure we'll do the right job.
Thanks so much. I particularly enjoyed your mention of a big, thorny, unresolved issue of sanctions, just sliding that in at the end of our session to say, and we also need to sort this out, because it's true. If there aren't the sanctions in place, and if crucially they're not properly enforced, then actually the data in registers isn't going to be complete, it's not going to be up to date, or it's not going to be accurate. So there's an interplay between this and all of the other challenges that we talked about. But I also hear from what everyone has said in the comments and chat that there really are some exciting opportunities ahead. And I would hope that actually the next iteration of the Global Data Barometer, if that's done, I'm not sure when it's likely to be done, in a couple of years' time or so, that should look really different in terms of the corporate ownership module. If we extrapolate from where we're at, we can expect that a lot more countries will have the legal framework in place for beneficial ownership disclosure. And crucially, that number of countries where data is publicly available, as Stephen was saying, that number should be much higher, and all of that unlocks greater potential to actually use and work with the data. And I think I'll just end by saying the point that has come up throughout this discussion on engaging more with the private sector. both through trade associations, as you mentioned, Oluseun, and through things like the UN Global Compact. I was really pleased to see on the IACC agenda, for those of you who have been following that, the International Anti-Corruption Conference in Washington, DC next month. There is a session dedicated to mobilizing private sector support for beneficial ownership reform that's held by hosted by Open Ownership's partner, the B team. So that's really exciting, and I think indicative of the fact that companies more and more often now are becoming active participants in dialogue around beneficial ownership, transparency, and an increasing number of companies are supporting the calls for reform. We certainly saw that in the work Open Ownership has been doing to study how the US legislation for beneficial ownership got passed, and how bringing on board key actors from the private sector was really a crucial part of that. So all in all, we've come a long way in the last 4 years. But although there's still a long way to go, as cliche as it might sound, I want to thank all of our speakers for sharing your expertise and perspectives on what's important, where we've come, and what still needs to be done. So Macheri, perhaps I should hand back to you to close us, but this is it from me. Thank you everyone for your time.
Thank you so much, Louise, and thank you so much also to the panelists, Florencia, Stephen, and Oluseun. It's a pleasure to have you on this roundtable on state of open data for company information. And yes, I think one of the things that is very clear that some of these things are not. I know we talked about the Tim Law's comment about the technical to was it political to technical? That challenge of making that connection, that crossing that bridge, but then also the fact that a lot of this is also extremely political, and so a lot of the work that we have to do sometimes might not be on this side of the portals and the actual platforms, but also a lot has to do with getting the right political will and getting the private sector to the table, getting them more engaged. So I'm really glad to hear that. And I think also, I think one of the things that we're looking at in Africa, I missed the Africa OGP regional meeting. I hope you were there. But there's been some progress around that beneficial ownership register conversation and putting together a standardized thing on the continent. And I think for those of us working on the continent around beneficial ownership and the adjacent issues around like open contracting, etc., there's an opportunity to try and get our countries to adopt commitments in the OGP action plans to advance this a little bit further, so that we go from registers that exist that are standards compliant to registers that exist that are standards compliant and open. That's the journey we are in Kenya, and I'm hoping that a number of African colleagues will help us advance that. I think the African countries didn't do very well in the GDP in the GDP theme on company ownership. So maybe that's for the next edition. My colleagues on the continent are calling you to arms. Let's move this forward. But thank you. So I think for those of you who've heard us talk about the global data barometer, if you'd like to know more about it, please check out the website. It's globaldatabarometer.org. You can follow them on Twitter as well, and get updates and information on products, research papers, etc., events, and the next edition of the GDB when it eventually takes off. Hopefully, probably in another year or so. The current edition is still fresh off the press, so do visit the website, look at the data, look at the analysis, and see what our partners around the ecosystem have been doing, such as open ownership, on the data issues around company ownership. So we have come to the end of today's session and today's set of sessions in this series. Looking forward to seeing as many of you as can make it tomorrow. 1300 GMT will be right here in the Zoom room talking about open data on land ownership. That's bound to be a very, very exciting conversation. It's we have a record number of registrations for that. So hoping that some of you will make it for that as well. There is a very close link between company ownership and land as well, especially in the global south. So I'm sure you will find familiar faces and familiar conversations there. And then of course we will close out the day tomorrow at with our session starting at 1400 GMT. 1300. No, okay, I've mixed up the times. But you can see the exact times on our d4d.net events page. I'll save myself from a thorough punishment from Anna Sophia. I'm sorry. And close this out today and say thank you so much. Looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. This was recorded. It's live streamed on YouTube. So if you missed most of it, or you are finding out about it now, you could check it out on YouTube on the Data for Development and d4d.net page on YouTube. So I think that's about it from me. Anna Sophia, any housekeeping, last announcements, etc.?
No, thank you all, and hope to see you tomorrow.
All right, excellent.
Take care.
Mohammed asks about the link for tomorrow's session.
Thank you.
If you go to d4d.net, click on the events tab, you will see it listed there, and you can click on the link, and you'll be sorted out. All right. Thank you, everyone.